They dodged Soviet patrols by listening to the whine of their snowmobile engines on the wind, hiding in ice caves when Mi-8 helicopters thumped overhead. The cold was a relentless enemy, a razor that stole heat and feeling from exposed skin in minutes. The terrain was a nightmare of pressure ridges and hidden crevasses, a landscape that seemed actively hostile to human life. When they finally reached the coordinates, after a brutal, final ascent up a windswept, rocky ridge, they expected to find a scar on the earth. They expected twisted metal, a debris field, the grim evidence of a violent end. They found none of that. Jax, looking through his powerful spotting scope from a vantage point a kilometer away, lowered it slowly, his face, usually an impassive mask, etched with confusion. He handed the scope to his second-in-command, a man called Fix-It. "Tell me what you see." Fix-It peered through the lens, adjusting the focus. He was silent for a long time. "I see a plane," he finally said, his voice flat with disbelief. Below them, nestled in a shallow, snow-dusted valley that shouldn't have been able to accommodate a landing of any kind, was the Starwalker. It was not a wreck. It was pristine. The sleek, black aircraft sat perfectly upright on its tricycle landing gear, as if it had taxied to a halt on a runway. There were no scorch marks from a crash, no shattered canopy, no broken wings. The skin of the aircraft was intact, the delicate seams of its radar-absorbent tiles unbroken. A light dusting of snow had accumulated on its upper surfaces, giving it a ghostly, ethereal quality. It looked like a museum exhibit, a statue placed in the wilderness by some forgotten civilization. It was a sight that defied every law of aviation, of physics, of logic. It was not crashed. It had been parked. The team moved in, their weapons raised, their senses screaming. They established a perimeter, their eyes scanning the surrounding ridges for any sign of a trap. The only sound was the moan of the Arctic wind. Jax approached the aircraft first, his footsteps crunching in the snow. He reached out a gloved hand and touched the cold titanium of the fuselage. It was real. He peered through the canopy. The cockpit was dark, but he could make out the shapes of the instruments, the pilot's seat. It was empty. He keyed his satellite radio, his voice a low, tense whisper that would be compressed and bounced to a relay satellite and down to a waiting ear in Washington. "Stormcaller to base. We are on site. The asset is secure and intact. I repeat, the asset is fully intact. No visible damage. Landing gear is down. The site shows no signs of impact or crash landing. It's just sitting here." 1,000 miles away, in the operations center, Colonel Vance and Dr. Finch listened to the transmission. They looked at each other, the same unspoken horror in their eyes. The mystery had not been solved. It had deepened into something far stranger, far more terrifying. The question was no longer how the Starwalker had crashed. The question was, who, or what, had landed it. The wind that swept down from the polar ice cap was a scalpel, carving away at the resolve of the men gathered around the impossible aircraft. It hissed around the Starwalker's vertical stabilizer, whipping the fine, crystalline snow into ghostly spirals. For the operatives of the Icarus Storm Team, their training had prepared them for ambushes, for firefights, for the grim task of recovering bodies and wreckage. It had not prepared them for this silent, pristine monument to a violated reality. Jax, his face a mask of frost and grim determination, circled the aircraft. His eyes, narrowed against the glare, scanned every seam, every rivet. There were no skid marks in the permafrost behind the tires, no gouges from a hard landing. The landing gear struts were fully extended, uncompressed, as if the plane had been gently lowered into place by some celestial crane. It was the most unnerving sight of his professional life. "Stormcaller to base," he murmured into his throat mic, the words forming tiny clouds of vapor. "We are initiating cockpit inspection. Perimeter is secure, but this is wrong, sir. All wrong." In the operations center, 1,000 miles away, Colonel Vance leaned forward, his knuckles white on the console. Dr. Finch stood beside him, his arms crossed tightly, as if holding himself together. "Proceed with extreme caution, Stormcaller," Vance replied, his voice a study in controlled tension. "Assume everything is a potential hazard." On the ground, Jax gestured to Fix-It, the team's technical specialist. Fix-It, a compact man whose hands were steady even in 40 below zero, approached the cockpit. The canopy, a single, vast bubble of specially formulated acrylic, was sealed tight. He ran a gloved hand along its seam, feeling for the emergency release. It was locked. Using a specialized tool from his pack, he carefully bypassed the external latch. There was a faint hiss of equalizing pressure, a sound that seemed deafening in the Arctic silence. The canopy unlocked. With Jax providing cover, Fix-It pushed it upward on its hinges. The interior of the cockpit yawned open, a time capsule sealed for 11 months in the deep freeze. The air that sighed out was cold, sterile, and carried a faint, metallic odor of ozone and something else. Something unidentifiable. They peered inside. The cockpit was not a scene of chaos. It was a scene of suspended animation. The control column was centered and neutral. The throttles were set to the approximate position for a high-altitude cruise. The myriad of analog gauges and the few, primitive digital displays were frozen, their needles and numbers captured in a single, eternal moment. The primary altimeter showed 85,000 feet. The Mach indicator was pegged at 3.2. It was a snapshot of the Starwalker at the peak of its performance, seconds before it vanished from the world. But it was the pilot's seat that held the gaze. It was empty. Crow's flight helmet was resting on the seat, strapped in place as per procedure. His oxygen mask was connected to its hose. His gloves were tucked neatly into a storage pouch. It was as if he had simply dematerialized mid-flight. There was no sign of a struggle, no smears of blood. The ejection sequence handles were still safetied. He hadn't attempted to escape. Base, the cockpit is vacant, Jax reported, his voice hollow. No pilot, no signs of ejection. It's like he was never here. Fix it, his curiosity overcoming his dread, leaned further in. He plugged a portable diagnostic reader into the aircraft's primary data bus. The system still had a residual charge. A faint, green power light glowed on the main console. The reader whirred, sucking the frozen data from the Starwalker's flight recorders. The data scrolled across the small screen, a stream of numbers and codes that told the story of the jet's final moments. I'm getting the flight data recorder dump now, Fix-It said, his brow furrowed. It's reading normal climb out, normal acceleration to cruise, all parameters nominal, right up to the last second. Then, he paused, scrolling. Then there's a single, massive data spike, a surge across all electrical systems. And then, a jump. Vance's voice crackled over the radio. What kind of jump? A coordinate jump, sir. The inertial navigation system. 1 second it's reading its position over the Barents Sea. The very next data frame, a fraction of a second later, it's registering these coordinates. Here, there's no record of flight between the 2 points. No descent. No turn. It's a teleport. The system must be corrupted. Dr. Finch grabbed a spare headset. The system isn't corrupted, he interjected, his voice tight with a terrifying excitement. The spike, describe it. Was it an electromagnetic pulse? A thermal overload? Negative, Dr. Fix-It replied, studying the raw data. It's uniform. Like the entire system was hit with a massive, simultaneous surge of power from an external source. It's not a failure signature. It's an infusion. The mystery had just deepened from a logistical nightmare into a realm of science fiction. The plane hadn't crashed. The pilot hadn't ejected. It had, according to its own immutable black boxes, simply ceased to be in one place and began to be in another. It was at that moment that the low, rhythmic thumping began. A sound felt in the chest before it was heard by the ears. Jax's head snapped up. Rotors. Multiple contacts, bearing east-northeast. The team scrambled. The canopy was hastily closed and re-secured. They melted back from the aircraft, taking up defensive positions among the rocks and ice ridges, their white Arctic camouflage making them ghosts against the snow. Within 60 seconds, 2 Soviet Mi-24, Hind, attack helicopters crested the ridge, their brutal, insectoid profiles stark against the pale sky. They were followed by a larger, twin-rotor Mi-8 transport. The Hinds circled like vultures, their chin-mounted cannons tracking slowly over the valley. The Mi-8 settled into a hover, then landed 100 yards from the Starwalker, its downdraft blasting the area with a storm of ice particles. The game was up. Someone else had been listening. The men who disembarked from the Mi-8 were not regular army. They wore the distinctive, mottled white and grey uniforms of the KGB's border troops, and they moved with the lethal efficiency of Spetsnaz. Their leader was a Colonel Gregor Volkov, a man with a face like a slab of granite and eyes the color of a winter sea. He took in the scene with a single, sweeping glance, the American operatives hidden in the rocks, the pristine, impossible American spy plane sitting in the middle of Soviet territory. A lesser man might have given the order to open fire. Volkov simply smiled, a thin, cold crack in the stone of his face. He walked calmly to the center of the clearing, holding his hands away from his sidearm. I assume one of you speaks Russian. He called out, his voice carrying easily over the wind. Jax, after a moment's hesitation, stood and stepped out from behind his cover, his own weapon held low but ready. I do, he replied in fluent Russian. Excellent, Volkov said. Then you can explain what this imperialist provocation is doing in the motherland. He gestured with his chin towards the Starwalker. And where, precisely, is its pilot? We would very much like to speak with him. The aircraft experienced a navigational failure, Jax said, reciting the pre-briefed cover story without conviction. It was on a routine atmospheric research flight over international waters. We are here on a humanitarian mission to recover our lost pilot and equipment. Volkov's cold smile returned. Do not insult my intelligence, Toverist. That is an Lockheed A-12, or a derivative. A spy plane. And it was not on a research flight. Our radars, from the DNEPR network to our newest dial systems, saw nothing. Not a whisper. This aircraft is a ghost. And now it has appeared in the one place it could not possibly be, without either of our nations knowing how it got here. This is not a political problem. This is a mutual problem. The standoff stretched for hours, then days. The two groups of elite soldiers, mirror images of each other, established separate perimeters in the sub-zero cold. A tense, unspoken truce held. Neither side could risk a firefight that would destroy the aircraft or reveal its existence to the wider world. The Americans couldn't explain its presence, and the Soviets couldn't explain its absence from the defenses. They were trapped in a paradox of their own making. Encrypted messages flew between the valley and the highest levels of power in Washington and Moscow. The Politburo was apoplectic, demanding the plane be seized. The Pentagon was equally adamant it be recovered. But in the back channels, among the few cooler heads who understood the staggering implications, a different idea was forming. A secret, face-to-face meeting was arranged in a dacha outside of Moscow, attended by a senior, unnamed official from the CIA and an equally shadowy figure from the KGB's first chief directorate. Colonel Vance and Dr. Finch were present as technical advisors. The Soviet side had their own scientist, a grim-faced man from the Zhukovsky Central Aerohydrodynamic Institute. The arguments were circular and fraught. The Americans insisted the plane was theirs by right. The Soviets insisted it was on their soil, a prize of war. But the unspoken truth hung over the negotiation like a pall. The how was more important than the what. The plane's very existence in that location was a threat to both sides. It represented a technology, a phenomenon, that bypassed all their defenses, that rendered their multi-billion ruble air defense networks obsolete. It was an existential puzzle. Our radar logs are absolute, the KGB man stated flatly. The aircraft did not fly here. It did not cross our border. Therefore, it was not there to be detected. Our flight data is equally absolute, Finch countered, his voice trembling with passion. The aircraft did not fly here through conventional means. The laws of physics, as we understand them, were violated. It was the Soviet scientist who finally broke the deadlock. Then we are not arguing over property, he said, his voice quiet but commanding. We are arguing over a mystery that humiliates us both. You cannot explain how it arrived. We cannot explain how we failed to prevent it. To admit this publicly would shatter the myth of mutual deterrence. It would reveal that a third, unknown actor, or a natural phenomenon we cannot control, can place an object in the heart of our territory at will. That is a vulnerability neither of our governments can acknowledge. A grim understanding settled over the room. The Cold War was built on a foundation of known unknowns. This was an unknown unknown. It was in everyone's interest to bury it. The deal was struck in the early hours of the morning. It was a treaty that would never see the light of day. The United States would be allowed to recover the aircraft. In return, the Soviet Union would receive a complete, sealed technical briefing on everything learned from the forensic analysis of the airframe. All data would be shared. All knowledge of the event would be purged from official records on both sides. The story of the lost Starwalker would remain a story of a training accident over the sea. Major Crow would remain officially missing. The Rybaki Peninsula incident never happened. The recovery was a logistical ballet of breathtaking audacity. A U.S. Navy heavy-lift ship, disguised as a civilian ice-strengthened cargo vessel, was dispatched to the remote coast. Under the watchful eyes of Soviet observers, a team of American engineers, working in a blistering blizzard, carefully dismantled the Starwalker. Using massive, purpose-built helicopters brought in on the ship, they airlifted the sections, fuselage, wings, tail, out to the waiting vessel. The whole operation was conducted in a tense, surreal silence, a cooperation between mortal enemies bound by a shared secret. Back on the ship, and later in a shrouded hangar at the secret Groom Lake facility in Nevada, the real investigation began. The airframe was taken apart bolt by bolt, wire by wire, by a team of engineers and scientists working under the grim supervision of Dr. Finch. What they found did not bring closure. It only deepened the horror. The metallurgists were the first to report anomalies. Samples of the titanium hull were subjected to stress tests. The molecular structure showed patterns of incredible, instantaneous stress and release, but not from acceleration or deceleration. It was as if the airframe had been subjected to a massive, uniform pressure from all sides simultaneously, a pressure that would have crushed a submarine at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. It's like it was squeezed in the hand of a giant, and then released, one of the lead engineers told Finch, his face pale. The analysis of the flight data recorders, now cleaned of corruption, revealed that time gaps Fixit had glimpsed. Between the last data point over the Barents Sea and the first at the Rybaki site, there was not a single frame of data, not a millisecond of recorded time. The clocks in the avionics had simply stopped, and then started again, 11 months later, in a new location. It was a hole in time. But the most chilling discovery came from the specialized, one-off sensors that had been part of the Nightfall 7 payload. They were designed to measure high-altitude plasma and radiation, data crucial for developing countermeasures against the new Soviet radar. Buried in their protected memory cores was a single, insane data point. Just before the final data spike in the time gap, for a duration of less than 3 seconds, the Starwalker's altimeter had not stopped at 85,000 feet. A backup, experimental sensor designed to measure exo-atmospheric particle density had spiked to an impossible reading. It indicated the aircraft had briefly, instantaneously, reached an altitude of over 250,000 feet, far into the upper thermosphere, a realm reserved for orbital spacecraft, a place where the air is thinner than a laboratory vacuum and the very notion of flight is meaningless. Finch sat alone in his office, surrounded by the dissected corpse of the machine he had helped create. He held the printout from that sensor in his hand. The numbers were irrefutable. He thought of Crow, sitting at the controls of a machine that was suddenly, impossibly, in the void between the Earth and space. He thought of the empty cockpit. He thought of the metal, stressed by forces beyond comprehension. He picked up a secure line and called Colonel Vance. "Elias," he said, his voice old and tired. "We're not looking at a crash. We're not even looking at an espionage mission anymore. What are we looking at, Alistair?" Vance asked, the weight of years in his voice. Finch stared at the data, at the story it told of a journey that should not have been possible. "We're looking at a vehicle," he whispered, "that went somewhere it wasn't supposed to. And we have to consider the very real possibility that something, or someone, sent it back." The official report, a document of exquisite bureaucratic fiction, was exactly 127 pages long. It was a masterpiece of omission, a narrative constructed not to reveal truth, but to build a fortress of plausible deniability around it. It spoke of a catastrophic and total structural failure over international waters, of a presumed deep water impact that precluded recovery. It cited the lack of debris, the absence of a distress signal, the silence of Soviet air defense networks, all the very things that made the event so terrifying, as evidence for its mundane conclusion. Major James Jester Crow was listed as missing, presumed killed. The Starwalker program was formally, and quietly, terminated. The file was stamped with a classification so high it didn't have a public name, only a code, 0LEVELIs only. It was then locked in a vault, not to be reviewed for 100 years. But in the quiet, windowless rooms where the real keepers of the secret lived, men like Colonel Elias Vance and Dr. Alistair Finch, the report was a kind of tombstone. It marked not an end, but a burial of the questions that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The cover story was a necessary lie, a pillar of the fragile, secret peace brokered on the Rybaki Peninsula. The Soviets had received their sealed technical briefing, a sanitized version of the forensic anomalies that pointed to a previously unknown high-altitude atmospheric electrical phenomenon. In return, they had allowed the husk of the Starwalker to be smuggled out of their territory, a mutual act of making the problem disappear. Both superpowers, in their own way, had looked into the abyss and agreed to pretend they hadn't. For the engineers and scientists at Groom Lake, the dismantled airframe became a ghost-haunting Hangar 18. It was the subject of a new, even more secret program, designated Crystal Light. Its goal was not to fly again, but to be understood. For years, teams picked over its bones, running every conceivable test. They subjected its strangely stressed titanium to electron microscopes, searching for clues in the atomic lattice. They built models to simulate the pressure from all sides phenomenon, but no earthly force could replicate the signature. The flight data recorders were played and replayed, the jump in coordinates and the gap in time a permanent, maddening loop. Theories, of course, flourished in the classified hothouse of the program. They were not written in official memos, but whispered in corridors over bad coffee. The most comfortable, the most palatable, was the navigational system glitch. Proponents argued that a cascade failure in the delicate, state-of-the-art INS, perhaps triggered by a solar flare or a previously unknown quirk of polar magnetism, had caused the computer to believe it was somewhere it wasn't. The jump in coordinates was a digital hallucination. The stress on the airframe, perhaps a violent, uncontrolled maneuver by the pilot as he fought a dying machine. The empty cockpit, a successful ejection over the sea that went tragically unrecorded. It was a theory that allowed for mechanical failure, for human error. It allowed the world to still make sense. But it strained to explain the pristine landing 1,000 miles away, the lack of a mayday, and the sensor reading of a brief, impossible ascent into the void. A more chilling school of thought pointed to experimental Soviet countermeasures. This theory held that the rumors about the Iron Citadel radar were true, but its purpose was far more sinister than mere detection. What if it was a weapon? A powerful, focused energy beam, a scalar weapon or a plasma projector, that could create localized atmospheric distortions, disorienting or even disabling aircraft. Perhaps it had temporarily gripped the Starwalker, creating the uniform pressure signature, and a system's failure during the event had caused the anomalous data. The landing in the USSR could then be explained as a controlled, dead-stick glide by a mortally wounded Crow, who then perished in the elements after touchdown. This theory had the benefit of fitting a Cold War narrative. The enemy had a superweapon, but it failed to explain the Soviets' genuine, palpable confusion, their own lack of radar contact, and their willingness to part with the prize. A superweapon was something you boasted about, not something you hid. Then there were the fringe theories, the ones discussed in hushed tones after the third drink. These centered on atmospheric and temporal distortions. Dr. Finch privately championed a version of this. He delved into obscure papers on quantum physics and gravitational anomalies. He posited that the Starwalker, flying at the very edge of the atmosphere where physics became strange, might have encountered a transient phenomenon. A knot in spacetime, a temporary wormhole, a window into another dimension. The massive energy surge, the time gap, the instantaneous relocation, it all fit a pattern of an object passing through a nonlinear pathway. The stress on the airframe was the strain of passing through a gateway not meant for matter. The altitude spike was not a vertical climb, but a reading taken elsewhere, a place with different physical constants. And Crow, he was the ultimate casualty of this exploration. Perhaps he was still in that other place. Perhaps he had been unmade by the transition. Perhaps he had simply stepped out. This was the theory that Finch and Vance, in their final years, came to silently accept. It was the only one that accounted for all the variables, however insane it sounded. It was the theory that transformed the Starwalker from a spy plane into a Voyager, and its loss from a military defeat into a cosmic tragedy. The decades passed. The Cold War thawed, then ended. The Soviet Union collapsed, and its archives were opened, revealing many secrets, but not this one. There was no record of the Rybacky standoff, no file on the strange American aircraft. The secret had been kept, a testament to the power of mutual fear. Colonel Elias Vance retired and died of a heart attack in 1998. He never spoke of the incident, but his daughter recalled that in his later years, he would often stand in his backyard on clear, cold nights, staring up at the stars with a look of profound and unsettling wonder. Dr. Alistair Finch lived until 2005. He spent his final years writing a dense, theoretical manuscript on the potential for macroscopic quantum tunneling. It was published to no acclaim in an obscure journal of speculative physics. Only a handful of people in the world would have understood that the complex equations describing transient topological anomalies in high-energy gravitational fields were, in fact, his final, coded testimony on the fate of the Starwalker. The dismantled airframe itself was eventually destroyed, its pieces melted down in a special furnace to prevent any fragment of its anomalous material from falling into unintended hands. The data was copied, encrypted, and stored on servers whose physical location is itself a secret. To this day, no official explanation has been released. The 0LEVELI's only classification remains in effect. The whispers persist in the intelligence community, a ghost story passed down from one generation of spies to the next. They speak of the plane that couldn't be there, of the pilot who vanished from his cockpit, of the deal with the devil, or the Politburo that buried the truth. Some claim a navigational system glitch. Others whisper about experimental radar fields and atmospheric distortions. A few, a very few, who have seen the redacted corners of the truth, say the jet didn't just disappear, it shifted. Into where? The vaults at Langley and the remnants of the KGB archives hold the only known fragments of the answer, and they're sealed with a silence as deep as space. The official custodians of the secret today, the men and women who inherit the burden Vance and Finch carried, have no more answers than their predecessors. They simply guard the question. Answer, the fact remains, cold and hard and undeniable, a monument to the limits of human knowledge. A Cold War aircraft, the fastest and highest flying ever built, vanished mid-mission over the Barents Sea, a victim of a mystery that humbled two superpowers. And 11 months later, it reappeared, silent and pristine, in the one place no theory of espionage, engineering, or physics could ever justify, a frozen valley in the heart of its enemy's territory, a riddle wrapped in titanium, sealed by a conspiracy of silence that endures to this day. The file remains locked. The truth, even tighter. The silence in the high-altitude reconnaissance operations center was a physical presence, thick and heavy, broken only by the low hum of cooling fans and the occasional, hushed crackle of a radio filter. The air smelled of stale coffee, ozone, and a peculiar, metallic tang of anxiety. It was 3:17 a.m., local time, at a base whose name did not appear on any public map, in a country that officially denied its existence. The men in the room, a select group of the Air Force's best and most stoic, were masters of waiting. They were accustomed to the long, silent stretches between a pilot's, feet wet, call over international waters and the final, blessed, feet dry, signaling a safe return. But this silence was different. It had crossed a threshold from routine into something ominous. The aircraft they were waiting for was not just any plane. It was the culmination of a billion-dollar black budget, a decade of radical physics, and a cold, calculated gamble. It was the fastest, highest-flying jet ever built, a machine designed to dance on the edge of the atmosphere where the sky bleeds into the blackness of space. Its official designation was classified. To the men who flew it and the men who nursed it, it was known simply as the Starwalker. Its mission profile was audacious in its simplicity. Penetrate denied airspace at an altitude so absurd that surface-to-air missiles were rendered impotent, their rocket motors starving for oxygen, their fins unable to bite the near vacuum. It would fly so fast that by the time a radar operator on the ground saw a ghostly, fleeting blip, if he saw it at all, it would be 100 miles past him, a shimmering memory in the ionosphere. And for 37 previous missions, it had worked flawlessly. It was a ghost, a rumor, a technological superstition the Soviets could never quite prove existed. Until tonight. The mission controller, a colonel named Elias Vance with a face like weathered granite and eyes that had seen too many secrets, finally broke the stillness. His voice was low, gravelly, barely above a whisper, but it carried across the tense room. Anything. A young captain manning the primary communications console didn't turn around. He just shook his head slowly, his shoulders slumped. Nothing, sir. Comms are dead. Telemetry feed terminated at 1:48. No beacon. It's just gone. Vanished. The word hung in the air, unspoken but understood by every man in the room. In their line of work, aircraft didn't just vanish. They were shot down. They crashed. They suffered catastrophic mechanical failure. But they left evidence. A mayday call. A debris field. A radar track that ended in a sudden, fiery bloom. This was different. This was an erasure. One moment, the Starwalker was a vibrant, data-spewing entity on their screens, a digital heartbeat pulsing at Mach 3.2, 85,000 feet over the Barents Sea. The next, it was a void. The mission had been designated Nightfall 7. Its target was a patch of desolate, frozen ground in the Kola Peninsula, a place the Soviet cartographers had labeled with a code, but which CIA analysts had dubbed the Iron Citadel. Rumors, pieced together from the whispers of defectors and shards of intercepted signals intelligence, suggested the Soviets were close to a breakthrough, a new, phased array radar system that could, in theory, see through the plasma sheath that formed around hypersonic vehicles, effectively peeling back the cloak of speed that protected assets like the Starwalker. Nightfall 7 was to be the proof. A single, high-resolution pass, its bank of cameras with lenses ground to near perfection clicking away, capturing the truth on rolls of specialized film. Get in, get the photos, get out. The pilot was Major James Jester Crow, a man so calm under pressure he was rumored to have a heartbeat that could be used to calibrate a metronome. His final transmission, logged at 1:47, was as unremarkable as all the others. Starwalker is feet wet, proceeding on profile. All systems nominal. Nominal. The most beautiful word in the engineering lexicon. And then, 12 seconds later, the green icon on the large tactical map at the front of the room simply winked out. Not a fade. Not a flicker. A blink, from existence to nothingness. Colonel Vance walked slowly to the large, plexiglass-covered map, his boot heels clicking on the linoleum floor. He traced the last known position with a calloused finger. It was over international waters, but only just. A diplomatic nightmare, but one they were prepared for. Deny everything. The plane, if it existed, which it didn't, was on a routine navigation exercise. Standard procedure. But the absence of debris, the lack of a Soviet claim of a shoot-down, that was the real mystery. The Soviets loved nothing more than parading a captured pilot or displaying the wreckage of American imperialist aggression on television. Their silence was as deafening as the void on Vance's screens. He turned from the map, his jaw set. Initiate retrieval protocol Sierra Sierra, he ordered, his voice devoid of emotion. And get me a secure line to Langley. It's time to wake the old man. The old man was Dr. Alistair Finch, a theoretical physicist who had traded the hallowed halls of MIT for the windowless, soundproofed corridors of the CIA's Directorate of Science and Technology. He was one of the handful of people on the planet who understood the Starwalker not just as a machine, but as a physical manifestation of a mathematical concept. He had been there at its birth, a series of wild, napkin-scribbled equations that challenged the very laws of known aerodynamics. Finch's office was a controlled chaos of books, blueprints, and half-disassembled electronic components. When the secure phone on his desk emitted its unique, soft chirp, he was deep in a treatise on quantum tunneling. He picked up the receiver, knowing the call at this hour could mean only one thing. Finch, he said. Alistair, it's Vance. The voice from the other end was tight, strained. We've lost Nightfall 7. Finch felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. Lost how? Mechanical. Sam, we don't know. It just disappeared. 1 second it was there, the next it wasn't. No distress signal, no telemetry drop-off, No explosion on satellite imagery. It's as if it flew into a doorway and someone closed it behind him. Finch leaned back in his chair, his mind racing through the possibilities. A catastrophic structural failure. Possible, but the telemetry would have shown the cascade. A missile. Unlikely at that altitude and speed, and there would be some evidence. A new, unknown Soviet weapon. The thought was chilling. He thought of the pilot, Crow. A good man. Brilliant, even. The Soviets? Finch asked, though he already knew the answer. Quiet as a tomb, Vance replied. Too quiet. They'd be screaming from the rooftops if they'd bagged a Starwalker. This silence. It's wrong, Alistair. It feels like they're as confused as we are. Or they're responsible for something they don't want to admit to, Finch mused. A weapon they can't explain, or one that violates a treaty they're secretly testing. My thoughts exactly. We're scrambling the Orion birds to look for debris, but the Barents is a big, cold, and unforgiving place. And if it went down on the Soviet side, Vance left the sentence hanging. The international implications were a minefield. Keep me apprised, Elias. I'll start running some theoretical scenarios on my end. Finch hung up the phone and stared at the complex equations on his blackboard. He wasn't just thinking about missiles or mechanical failure. He was thinking about the edges of physics, about the strange, transient phenomena reported by pilots flying at the very frontier of the sky. Plasma instabilities, high-altitude electrical phenomena, things that weren't in any manual. The Starwalker was more than a spy plane, it was a laboratory, pushing into realms where the rules were still being written. And perhaps, Finch thought with a growing sense of dread, it had finally pushed too far. Weeks turned into months. The official, internal investigation, codenamed Project Phantom, concluded with the bland, bureaucratic language of catastrophe, presumed lost due to catastrophic mechanical failure, location of wreckage unknown. The file was stamped, classified at the highest level, and buried in a vault. A quiet, somber memorial service was held for Major Crow at Arlington. He was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. His wife was given a folded flag and a story about a training accident over the Mediterranean. She was a military wife. She knew the look in the officer's eyes who delivered the news. She knew the story was a lie, but she also knew she would never know the truth. The world moved on. The Cold War continued its frigid, paranoid dance. The loss of the Starwalker was a devastating blow, a secret defeat that forced a recalculation of American strategic reconnaissance. The program was put on indefinite hold. The remaining aircraft were cocooned and hidden away in climate-controlled hangars carved into Nevada mountains. The brilliant minds who had built them were reassigned, their dreams of limitless speed and altitude grounded by a mystery. But in the intelligence community, some wounds never fully heal. For Colonel Vance and Dr. Finch, the case was a splinter in the mind. The lack of closure was a constant, nagging itch. They maintained a clandestine, informal dialogue, sharing fragments of information that fell outside the official purview of Project Phantom. A strange atmospheric disturbance report from a Norwegian weather station. An anomalous radio signal intercepted by a listening post in Turkey. Pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit together. Then, nearly 2 years after the disappearance, a fragment of data surfaced that was too bizarre, too impossible, to ignore. It came not from a spy satellite or a signals intelligence analyst, but from a graduate student in glaciology at the University of Cambridge. Her name was Dr. Anja Sharma, and she was studying ice core samples from the Vatnajökull Glacier in Iceland, correlating volcanic ash layers with historical climate data. As part of her work, she was using newly declassified satellite imagery from the U.S. Geological Survey to track glacial flow patterns over the decades. She was meticulously comparing a series of images of a remote, inaccessible ice field taken in 1978 and 1980, looking for subtle shifts. And she found one. But it wasn't a shift in the ice. It was an object. In the 1978 image, the ice field was pristine, a vast, white emptiness. In the 1980 image, taken by a Landsat satellite, there was a dark, distinct, cruciform shape embedded in the glacier. It was small, a mere speck at that resolution, but the shape was unmistakably that of an aircraft. And not just any aircraft. The long, slender fuselage, the peculiar engine nacelles, the unique delta wing configuration, it was a match for the design principles of the Starwalker. A design that was the most closely guarded secret of the American military-industrial complex. Dr. Sharma, thinking she had stumbled upon the wreckage of a lost commercial flight or a vintage World War II plane, did what any good academic would do. She published her findings in a small, specialized journal, the International Archives of Glacial Geomorphology, in a dry, technical paper titled, Anomalous Supraglacial Deposition on Vatnajökull, a potential case study for high-altitude debris transport. The paper was obscure, its readership limited to a few hundred scientists worldwide, but it was indexed, and one of the low-level analysts at the CIA, whose job it was to run automated searches for specific keywords across all global scientific publications, flagged it. The keyword was aircraft. The attached image made the analyst spill his coffee. The report landed on Colonel Vance's desk 30 minutes later. He stared at the grainy, black and white satellite photo, his blood running cold. He immediately placed a secure call to Alistair Finch. "Alistair, you need to get to Langley. Now." "Elias, it's midnight," Finch grumbled. "I don't care. We found it." A pause. "The wreckage. In the Barents." "No," Vance said, his voice trembling with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "We found it in Iceland." "Iceland? That's 1,000 miles from his flight path. It's geographically impossible. The fuel load, the glide ratio. It can't be. Look at the photo, Alistair." Vance fed the image through the secure fax line. The machine in Finch's study word to life, slowly printing out the stark, pixelated image. Finch stared at the emerging shape. He saw it immediately. The profile was unmistakable. It was the Starwalker, intact, or at least, it appeared to be. It was sitting on the surface of the glacier, as if it had made a perfect, if unconventional, landing. "My God," Finch whispered. "How in the name of all that is holy did it get there?" That was the question. The impossible place. The glacier was a fortress of ice, surrounded by treacherous terrain and volatile weather. It was a location that defied all logic. For the Starwalker to be there, one of two things had to be true. Either it had flown there under its own power after its supposed destruction, which was mechanically and logistically impossible, or some unimaginable force had deposited it there, like a child dropping a toy in a field of snow. The official story was a lie. The investigation was a sham. The truth was waiting for them, frozen in time on a remote Icelandic glacier. And for Vance and Finch, the mission was no longer about closure. It was about unraveling the greatest aviation mystery of the Cold War, a mystery that had just become infinitely more strange, more dangerous, and more profound. The race to recover the Starwalker, and the secrets it held, had just begun. The theory was a solid, comfortable one, the first port in any storm of military catastrophe. It was the narrative the Pentagon's contingency planners had war-gamed 100 times. A Soviet surface-to-air missile, a brilliant orange flower of detonation blooming at 80,000 feet, tearing the delicate titanium skeleton of the Starwalker into a million glittering pieces, scattering them across the icy, churning waters of the Barents Sea. It was a clean explanation. An honorable one. It meant the technology had been matched, the enemy had finally caught up. It was a loss they could understand, a wound they could compartmentalize. A back-channel, ultra-secure line was activated, a wire of tense diplomacy that ran directly from a secure vault in the Pentagon to a similar, grim room within the Soviet Ministry of Defense. The communication was not an admission, but a probe, cloaked in the language of mutual concern and accident investigation. The American inquiry was a masterclass in subtlety. Had there been any unusual air defense activity in the Barents sector on the night in question? Any training exercises that might have involved live fire? Any anomalies? The reply, when it came after a deliberately agonizing 48-hour silence, was not what they expected. It wasn't the blustering, triumphant propaganda they had braced for. It wasn't a demand for an apology or a threat of retaliation. It was, if anything, profoundly unnerving in its blandness. The Soviet response, delivered by a stone-faced general whose name was a footnote in a dozen intelligence dossiers, was a masterpiece of bureaucratic nothingness. Their air defense networks, he stated with the flat tone of a man reading a grocery list, had registered no unauthorized incursions into sovereign airspace that night. Their radar sweeps, from the primitive early warning stations on the Kola Peninsula to the advanced Zenit arrays rumored to be operational near Murmansk, had shown nothing but the usual commercial traffic and a few of their own patrol aircraft. There had been no missile launches, no alerts, no scrambles of their interceptor squadrons. The logs, he assured them, were clean. To the men in the Pentagon Situation Room, this was more terrifying than a declaration of war. The Soviets were many things, brutal, duplicitous, expansionist, but they were not liars about this. Not when they held all the cards. If they had shot down a Starwalker, they would have paraded the wreckage on the evening news. They would have mounted the twisted titanium on a plinth in Red Square as a testament to the triumph of Soviet engineering. Their silence, the denial, could only mean one thing: they were telling the truth. To the USSR, the jet had never existed. It was a phantom that had left no shadow on their scopes, no echo in their command bunkers. And to the US, the nation that had built it, fueled it, and launched it into the night, it had simply evaporated. The solid, comfortable theory of a shoot-down shattered, leaving behind a vacuum of understanding, a void more profound and disturbing than any combat loss. This void had to be filled. And so began the search, a frantic, sprawling, and ultimately futile operation that stretched across the top of the world. It was given a bland, innocuous codename, Project Dustbin. Its mission was to find a needle in a haystack the size of a continent, a needle that had potentially been vaporized. The resources committed were staggering. From a secret hangar in Alaska, a different, slower, but infinitely more patient bird was unleashed, the RC-135 River Joint. Packed not with cameras, but with a forest of antennas and banks of spectral analyzers, its mission was to fly lazy, patient orbits over international waters, its electronic ears straining for a whisper. It listened for the faint, distinctive ping of an emergency locator transmitter, the kind that was supposed to survive a crash and float, broadcasting its mournful signal for weeks. It listened for any stray radio transmission, any fragment of a voice that might be crow's. The airwaves yielded only static and the usual cacophony of Soviet military traffic, which was analyzed, decoded, and found to contain not a single reference to the lost aircraft. Meanwhile, high above, in the silent, airless realm of polar orbit, the KH-11 Kennen reconnaissance satellites, America's all-seeing eyes in the sky, were retasked. Their powerful telescopes, capable of reading a license plate from 100 miles up, were now trained on a vast swath of ocean and barren Soviet coastline. Analysts at the National Photographic Interpretation Center, NPIC, in Washington, D.C. worked in shifts, their eyes red raw from staring at light table magnifiers, scanning thousands of square kilometers of film. They were looking for the telltale signs of a high-impact crash, a scorch mark on the tundra, a disturbance in the water, a glint of metal amidst the ice. They found nothing. No debris field spreading its metallic stain across the dark waters of the Barents. No scorched crater on the rocky, lichen-covered shores of Novaya Zemlya. No heat bloom from a burning fuel spill registered on their infrared sensors. No telltale, hopeful speck of a white parachute canopy against the bleak landscape. It was as if the multi-ton, billion-dollar aircraft, a machine the length of a school bus, had been plucked from the sky by the hand of God. The absence of evidence became a presence in itself, a heavy, suffocating dread that settled over the investigation. The laws of physics dictated that the Starwalker had to be somewhere. It could not have simply ceased to be. And yet, every tool at the disposal of the most technologically advanced nation on Earth screamed that it had. Weeks bled into a month. The frantic energy of the initial search gave way to a grim, grinding routine, and then to a somber acceptance. The river-joined flights were scaled back. The satellite coverage was returned to its usual targets. The analysts at NPIC were reassigned. In a secure conference room deep within the E-ring of the Pentagon, a final meeting was convened. The attendees were a somber collection of generals, intelligence chiefs, and a solitary, haggard-looking Colonel Vance. A single sheet of paper was passed around the polished mahogany table. It was the final report of Project Dustbin. Its conclusions were stark, its language chosen for its ability to close a file, not to enlighten. After an exhaustive aerial and satellite reconnaissance campaign of all plausible and several implausible impact zones, it read, no physical evidence of the aircraft, its systems, or its pilot has been located. The lack of any corroborating signal intelligence or evidence of hostile action leads this board to conclude that the asset was lost due to a catastrophic and total structural failure over deep water, precluding recovery. The recommended disposition was a single, cold line, operational loss, no recovery possible. Vance stared at the words, catastrophic and total structural failure. It was the aviation equivalent of, died of natural causes. A polite, professional fiction. It covered everything and explained nothing. He thought of Crow, a man he'd shared a drink with just 48 hours before the mission. He thought of the plane, a masterpiece of engineering that had simply vanished. As the others filed out, the director of Central Intelligence, a patrician figure named Morrow, placed a hand on Vance's shoulder. It's over, Elias. We've looked everywhere we can look. Sometimes, the Earth just swallows things. We write the report, we mourn our man, and we move on. That's the job. Vance nodded, the perfect soldier. But as he walked out of the Pentagon that evening, into the crisp Washington air, he knew it wasn't over. The official story was a shroud, thrown over a mystery that was now colder than the depths of the Barents Sea. The file was closed, stamped, and buried. But for Vance, and for a select few others, the echo of that silence at 1:48 would never fade. It was a question that had been asked into the void, and the void had answered with a deeper, more profound silence. The search was over. The mystery had just begun. The silence that followed the official closure of the case was, in its own way, louder than the frantic chaos of the search. For Colonel Elias Vance, the 11 months that passed were a study in bureaucratic purgatory. He'd been reassigned to a desk job at the Pentagon, analyzing dry threat assessments of Soviet tank divisions in East Germany. It was important work, but to him, it felt like watching a play from the back row after having been the lead actor. The memory of the Starwalker's disappearance was a phantom limb, an ache that flared with every clear, cold night, with every report that crossed his desk from the Northern Fleet. He kept a small, unmarked file in his desk drawer, a personal heresy against the official record. In it were his own notes, the strange atmospheric reports from Norway, the anomalous radio signal from Turkey, fragments that the Project Dustbin report had dismissed as irrelevant noise. He would take it out sometimes, late at night when the office was empty, and stare at the fragments, trying to force them into a pattern. But the pieces were too few, the gaps between them too vast. The official story was a clean, solid wall. His file was a collection of dust from its cracks. Dr. Alistair Finch had fared no better. The Starwalker program's indefinite hiatus had left him a general without an army, a theoretical mind with nothing left to theorize. He'd been shuffled back to pure research, tasked with evaluating the feasibility of particle beam weapons, a project he considered to be decades away from practicality. He felt like a watchmaker forced to smash rocks. The elegance, the audacity of the Starwalker, it had been the work of his life. Its loss was a personal and professional wound that refused to scar over. He found himself, in quiet moments, rerunning the final telemetry data through custom-built models, searching for a glitch in the matrix, a single bit out of place that could explain the utter totality of the vanishing. He found nothing. The machine was gone. Crow was gone. The mystery was a tomb sealed not with stone, but with paperwork. Then, on a Tuesday evening that was indistinguishable from any other, the tomb cracked open. It happened at a listening post so secret it was known only by a number, station GAMMA7. Carved into the granite of a Norwegian fjord, its massive, football field-sized radomes faced eternally east, their electronic ears drinking in the electromagnetic soup of the Soviet Union. The air inside was chilled to prevent overheating the banks of vacuum tube computers, and the constant, low-frequency hum was a sound that entered the bones of the men and women who worked there. A young Air Force technician, First Lieutenant David Shaw, was on the tail end of a monotonous 12-hour shift, monitoring a bank of spectrum analyzers tasked with scanning a range of frequencies known to be used for Soviet military drone control. It was boring, soul-crushing work. The screens showed the usual dance of carrier waves and data bursts, the rhythmic heartbeat of the Soviet war machine. At 22:17 Greenwich Mean Time, a spike appeared on one of his secondary monitors. It was a short, brutal pulse of encrypted data, lasting less than 2 seconds. It was clean, powerful, and utterly anomalous. It wasn't the messy, frequency-hopping chatter of Soviet comms. This was something else, something disciplined. Shaw frowned, his boredom instantly evaporating. He tagged the signal, and the computer automatically logged its parameters, frequency, duration, signal strength. It was the frequency that made him sit up straight. It was a UHF band, one that hadn't been active in. He called up the historical database. 11 months. It was a frequency reserved for a specific, ultra-classified asset. An asset listed as destroyed. His heart began to hammer against his ribs. He ran the signal through the first stage of decryption, using a specific cryptographic seed that was stored in a physical safe, to be used only in the event of. He didn't even want to think about it. The decryption was not meant to recover a message, but to verify authenticity. A few seconds later, a string of alphanumeric characters resolved on his screen. It was a system code, an automated, handshake protocol. And nestled within it was a string of digits that turned the blood in his veins to ice water, the unique, factory-assigned serial number of the airframe. SN101. Aurora. The plane was alive. Somewhere. The alert, codenamed Phoenix Rising, shot up the chain of command with the speed of a lightning strike. It bypassed normal channels, using the emergency protocols established for the Starwalker program. The phone on Colonel Vance's desk, a secure, red handset, rang at 4:32 a.m. Washington time. He was awake, unable to sleep, staring at the city lights from his apartment window. He picked it up on the first ring. Vance. The voice on the other end was the night watch officer at the NSA, a man Vance knew well. He sounded breathless, his usual professional calm shattered. Elias, it's Pete. We have a Phoenix Rising alert. Station GAMMA7. We got a pulse. Serial number confirmed. It's 101. It's Aurora. Vance's knuckles, gripping the receiver, were white. He felt the world tilt on its axis. The solid wall of the official story crumbled in an instant. Location. He barked, his voice rough with a sleep he hadn't been getting. That's the problem. We're working on it. The signal was too short for a solid triangulation. It's a bearing, not a fix. But the initial plot. Elias, it makes no sense. It's pointing deep inside the Arctic Circle. Soviet territory. The northern edge of the Kola Peninsula. The next 48 hours were a controlled frenzy within a handful of soundproofed rooms in Washington and Langley. The signal was analyzed, reanalyzed, and analyzed again. Every assumption was questioned, every piece of equipment at Gamma 7 was checked for malfunction. The conclusion was inescapable. The signal was genuine. It had come from SN101. The task of pinpointing its origin fell to the National Security Agency's elite signals intelligence wizards. Using a technique so classified its very existence was a state secret, they combined the single bearing from Gamma 7 with subtle Doppler shift analysis from two other, even more clandestine listening posts. It was a mathematical long shot, a process of triangulation with only 2.5 points. But slowly, agonizingly, a set of coordinates began to emerge from the digital fog. When the final numbers were presented to the emergency task force, Vance, Finch, and a handful of the most trusted intelligence brass in the country, the room fell into a stunned silence. The coordinates were not just in the Soviet Arctic, they were in one of the most remote, most desolate, and most heavily defended regions of it, the Rybaki Peninsula, a jagged, frozen fist of land jutting into the Barents Sea, north of Murmansk. It was a place honeycombed with early warning radar sites, SAM batteries, and Spetsnaz border patrols. It was a fortress. Dr. Finch was the first to speak, his voice a whisper of pure disbelief. That's impossible. He stood and walked to a large polar projection map on the wall. Look, the Rybaki Peninsula is here. He tapped a spot well north of the Arctic Circle. The Starwalker's last known position was here, over the Barents, southwest of Novaya Zemlya. Its fuel load, at Mach 3.2, gave it a combat radius of approximately 1,200 miles. The Rybaki Peninsula is over 800 miles from that point, in the wrong direction. It would have had to turn around, fly at a suboptimal speed and altitude to avoid detection for hundreds of miles, and then perform a landing, for God's sake, on a peninsula it was never supposed to go near, with less than zero fuel. The numbers don't just not add up, Elias. They scream that this is a fiction. It's not a fiction, Vance said, his voice low and firm. He pointed to the decoded serial number on the sheet of paper in front of him. That is not a fiction. The signal was real. The question is no longer if it's there. The question is how. The implications were staggering. If the Soviets had the intact airframe, they would have America's crown jewel of aerospace technology. They would have the secrets of its radar-absorbent coatings, its hypersonic engine design, its sensor suite. The entire strategic balance of the Cold War could tilt in an afternoon. They had to know. They had to see. A recovery mission was not just an option, it was a national imperative. But it was also a suicide mission. This was not picking up a piece of floating debris in international waters. This was sending men deep into the heart of the Soviet military's backyard. The operation was designated Icarus Storm. The team was drawn from the absolute best of the CIA's Special Activities Division and a handful of Air Force Special Operations Command personnel who had Arctic survival training. They were led by a man known only as Jax, a veteran of a dozen shadow wars whose face was a roadmap of scars and whose loyalty was to the mission, and only the mission. Their cover was a Norwegian scientific expedition, studying polar bear migration patterns. Their equipment was a mix of cutting-edge technology and rugged, Cold War-era gear that wouldn't betray its American origin if discovered. The insertion was a masterpiece of clandestine logistics. A modified, civilian-marked C-130, its engines muffled, flying nap of the Earth below Soviet radar coverage, dropped them and their specially designed snowmobiles and equipment pallets by parachute onto the frozen,